This is IVP.
This is The Disruptors, a podcast from InterVarsity Press.
Tracks never been a fabricator, but like MOK, I've been an agitator.
Hosted by me, Esau McCaulley. Taylor Schumann is a writer and activist, a survivor of gun violence, who is using her story to bring about lasting change, especially in helping Christians think about the ways they might be involved in reducing gun violence. I'm a New Testament professor. I'm not an interviewer. Okay, I'm not a podcast. That's
evident.
You see how you see how he treats me, Taylor?
I hear it. I'm with
this?
you.
This is why the Beatles broke up. You know, like Ringo wouldn't stay in his lane. Can I tell you something? This is true. I sat down and tried to listen to a Beatles song after season 1 because somebody mentioned them.
Oh my gosh, I was listening to this episode yesterday.
There we go. I tried to, after that episode, to sit down and listen to a Beatle. And I was just like, I don't get it.
Wait, what did you listen to?
I don't know. I just like Googled Beatles.
Oh no.
And is Yellow Submarine a movie or an album?
Oh my gosh. Wait, is it a movie?
Anyways, like I don't get it. The Monkees are pretty good. Hey, 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 it's the Monkees. That's a nice song.
I love that song.
I want to talk to Taylor because it's one of these things, these taboo topics that we're told as Christians aren't a part of kind of the entree of things, of political meals we're allowed to eat from. And so gun violence is one of those things where once you talk about it, and she says this during the podcast, once you talk about it, people start to get concerned about you. And I think it's really interesting that the moment that a Christian begins to question our right to be able to shoot other people, there's this immediate question of whether or not we are losing our faith. And it was really interesting for me as someone who lived abroad, like living in Europe gives you real perspective on how different gun culture is in the United States than it is in the rest of the world. And so I wanted to have someone on the podcast who could help us think through those things and who wasn't just simply an ideologue who's just like, who doesn't understand the other side. She talks about how she grew up in kind of a very gun culture and how her own experiences shaped the way that she views the world. And so I think she was a good guest because at least she understood that context. And she's a person who's disruptive. She talked about the price that it cost her to speak about gun activism in the church. And so I thought that that's an issue that I'm personally passionate about, but not super well informed. And so part of what I thought is that probably other people who listen to this Disruptors podcast, our profile probably reads a significant portion of our audience probably isn't pro, we can run around with AK-47s. That's probably not normal for a Disruptors listener. So I thought it would be good to have someone there. And she's someone who this is not just an abstract idea. It is something that happened to her. A lot of our guests, these are things that happen to them. Like I experienced racism. People experience gender violence. People experience discrimination. It's those experiences that are catalytic in moving people out into the world. And I think that's really great because she goes beyond being a victim of gun violence to being someone who wants to bring about lasting change. And so for someone who hasn't experienced gun violence, but who've been victims of various things, she's a testimony to how the worst things that happen to us don't have to break us. They can make us into something that is even stronger and more powerful for God. Who was Taylor Schumann before kind of the incident that seems to change your life and send you off in a certain direction?
So I grew up in Southwest Virginia, in a little town called Salem. And I grew up like in a Southern Baptist church. My family, all believers. And yeah, I went to a small school and I did all the right things that you're supposed to do. And I went to church and got good grades and had a lot of friends at church and that kind of stuff. So really just like a quiet middle class upbringing.
Were you one of those students and kids for whom like it all seemed to work? I mean, there are different people who have spiritual backgrounds who are kind of going through like these motions of doing the good grades and going to church every Sunday, but underneath there's like, I don't know about this. And some people are like, yeah, this is how I want to live my life. Would you say that like your spirituality and your faith and the school and the church all fit together when you were younger, or were there kind of other issues that you were pushing to the side?
I don't think it did. I had a really hard time at school, and like school didn't come naturally to me. And because I was so wrapped up like in what I was doing at church, all my friends were kind of there, and I had a hard time making different friends at school. And I remember kind of like slacking off a bit at school because I like over spiritualized my academic work, and I would just say, oh well, I went to church and I didn't study for this test, but God is going to honor my time at church, so I'll probably do good on the test anyway, and that kind of stuff. So it wasn't until like right before my senior year of school, I left the church that I had grown up in, and that was kind of when I got super involved at school and made a lot of friends and just really went out with a bang that senior year. But before then, everything had been really kind of separate, and I was very much known as like the church girl, and like Taylor does church, and that's kind of her thing.
So you were saying Jesus be a study guide? Is that what
Yeah,
your prayer?
Jesus be osmosis. I will just lay on this textbook and it will be fine.
And so your senior year, you get serious about school, and then did you decide to go to college? Where did you go?
So I I actually went to Liberty University for my freshman year.
Oh no!
Um,
Rip from the headlines.
right from the headlines, very
I got
poignant
I mean,
discussion.
I'm gonna leave that alone.
Yeah. Well, I had a terrible experience. I did not like it at all.
That's surprising.
And so I ended up transferring to Virginia Tech, and that's where I graduated from college.
What year did you graduate?
I graduated in 2012.
2012. Wow,
Mm-hmm.
you're making me feel old in the podcast. So you graduate in 2012, and then you start working.
Yeah, I actually got a job working as a social worker. I worked in crisis assistance for the city of Roanoke in Virginia. And I did that for almost a year. And then I took a job at a community college nearby. And that's where the shooting actually happened.
So, but before that, you were doing crisis assistance. So you were already in this place where you were trying to put your faith in. I mean, did your faith influence that kind of career choice, or was it a job that you got? I mean, help me understand that part of it. Were you kind of shifting towards how do I make my Christian life applicable to the actual experiences of people every day?
Yeah, and I knew I always wanted to work with people, and doing something where I could just really like actively be in sort of a helping position. I'm an Enneagram 2, so this seemed to fit quite well with my personality at that time. And also, I realized I had grown up in this area, kind of in a very secluded way, like in this small town, and I didn't really know what was happening like with my neighbors in the larger community. And there's all this poverty and all this suffering and this inequality that I had not been exposed to very much growing up. And so taking a job with the city really opened my eyes to like what I just didn't realize was existing because I didn't have to be exposed to it. And I know a lot of people in my life thought it would be like too hard for me, and I would internalize it, and I wouldn't be able to leave it at work. And that definitely was true for me. There were a lot of days I just didn't want to leave because I didn't know what was happening with my clients, and I didn't know if they were going to have heat overnight or if they were going to be able to pay their electric bill the next day. But for me, that wasn't so much a liability as it was that it meant I was like really doing the work and really invested in that job.
That's really interesting, the way that you said that, because there is this sense in which, and I don't want to criticize the people who said this to you because I don't know them, but there's a sense in which we want to say, well, if you get too involved in the day-to-day sufferings of people, then it's not sustainable, that it's going to kind of break you down. One of the things that we're exploring in season 2 of the disruptors is the disruption sustainable? Like once you come into something, and it's one thing to recognize that, hey, there's a problem. You know, we need to do something about gun violence. We need to do something about poverty. How do you go beyond kind of raising the flag to actually thinking day to day about what it means? And one of the things the Christians say is that, well, since you can't fix the problem, since it's not sustainable, it's going to do you damage. And it seems like the spiritual advice then is to say, well, okay, then the people have to suffer while the Christians protect their spiritual and emotional health to get to the kingdom of God at the end, which seems to be the opposite of what Jesus did, which is kind of this incarnation who's coming into the midst of the trauma. So I want to, so you, at this point, have you ever considered like gun violence or victim advocacy? Is this something that's on your radar, or is this
No.
all the result of what happens to you?
Yeah, I grew up in a town where, there's a lot of hunters, a lot of gun owners. It's very conservative. And even the people that don't own guns are like very still into guns and gun culture because that's just kind of ingrained in that area. And so I had never considered that, guns could be the problem. Guns don't kill people, people kill people, that kind of thing. But when I was working for social services, that December was when the shooting at Sandy Hook happened. I remember that was kind of the first moment I just thought, what are we doing? Like, how did this happen? And why are we letting this persist? But then I kind of just tucked it away. And it wasn't till after what happened to me and kind of the transformation I went through after that I really got involved in that space.
Can you tell me about, as much as you feel comfortable, like how being involved in a shooting changed you personally, and then how it made you into the person that you became as relates to gun violence and gun reform?
So after the shooting took place, I lost the majority use of my hand. I have about 20% use of my hand left. I kind of had this instant disability. I started dealing with chronic pain, a lot of things that I had never had to deal with before. And this like intense trauma and grief. And I had a pretty like comfortable life before that point and just never had to confront these types of issues in myself. And so the first thing I found was that it made me, I was already an extremely empathetic person, but this kind of took it to a new level. And I started seeing um, a lot of pain and suffering around me and people. And it made me, I think, a better friend to my friends who were going through really hard things. And it made me a better like advocate for those people. But ultimately, it kind of led me down this path of seeing this suffering that we were ignoring. After what happened to me happened, the gun part was largely ignored, and everyone kind of wanted to focus on the other things that we tend to blame gun violence on, mental health and all those things. And there was some of that there, but my story was very different. And the person that did it to me, and he didn't die during the shooting. He wasn't killed. He didn't take his own life. So we had to go through the whole court process. And that, again, was another thing I had never dealt with before. And just seeing what victims have to go through in our criminal justice system and how all of that works was obviously very new to me. And I was still very young. I was only, I guess I was 23 when this happened. And I just didn't know how all this stuff worked.
What role did your faith play in this? Did it challenge your faith? Did it grow your faith? Like how did you deal with this spiritually?
It definitely grew my faith. And it's one thing where I look back on that time and I never felt so close to God as I did during that time. And I think it sounds strange to people who haven't experienced that to say sometimes like I miss that, just how close I felt to God and how um, like not forced it felt. I felt like I didn't have to have all the right answers. I didn't have to pray the right things. I just felt God's presence with me. And in like these deep, dark moments, just his comfort and his goodness with me. And there were certainly times I was like very angry about what happened to me. And I think that was when I truly understood how honest I could be with God, and that my questions for him and my anger wasn't deterring him, but he was drawing closer to me in those moments. And that was really important for my faith to develop. And I think that has largely made me who I am now, especially my faith to say we can be honest with God, and he's not afraid of this, and he's sitting with me in it. Um, I don't ever remember really asking, why me? Why did you let this happen? But it was more of a, well, I survived. What am I supposed to do now? Like, why did this happen to me? Like, what do I do with it? Um, and God was very gracious with me in a lot of those moments of doubt and wondering and my anger and bitterness and all those things.
That shows something about you as a person, because not everyone who survives says, God, what do you want me to do with this? I know that for me, so I'm a little bit older than you, maybe significantly older. But I'm just now at the place where I'm consistently in the last couple of years kind of writing about racism and systemic injustice and the things that happened to me as a kid. I mean, I would in the book that I wrote, Reading While Black, there's a story in I think one of the chapters about the first time I was called the N-word that my mom didn't even know about until she read the book. And so you seem to have been like make a pretty quick transition from someone who experienced gun violence to someone who then becomes an advocate. How were you able to make that transition and to go beyond saying, I'm grateful to God that I survived, but part of my vocation now is bringing awareness to this issue? How did you become a disruptor?
I mean, the most like basic answer is that gun violence just kept happening, and I just kept seeing it around me. And initially after it happened, I wasn't like anti-gun. I didn't make that switch. I became very uncomfortable with guns, but it was mostly like an internally processing thing. Like, my family is still very pro-gun, and like it was instantly kind of a thing where my family was saying, oh, guns aren't the problem. And then there was another girl that was shot, and her family was saying, no, guns are the problem. And I felt very caught in the middle. And I remember getting interview requests from like local news and even some bigger news outlets. And they would ask for an interview, and I would say, okay, well, I'm not ready to talk about guns, but I can, talk about what happened to me. And then I'd never hear from them again. It all felt like I had to choose, and I wasn't ready to do that. And I didn't want to be used for anything that I wasn't like ready to dive into yet. And it wasn't until 2016 when the Pulse nightclub shooting happened. And I woke up that morning, it was a Sunday, and saw the news. And it was just so awful and so horrible. And we were getting ready for church, and I kind of didn't even want to go because those days are just really hard for me. But we decided to go anyway. And I just thought, as we drove to church, they have to say something about this shooting at church. Like, we have to talk about this. We have to pray for these people. They'll definitely say something. And then I sat through church, and nothing was said and nothing was said. And it was towards the end, I just realized, like, we're not going to talk about this because we don't talk about this. And I had never had that feeling before, like in a Christian space. I just never expected it to be brought up, like the issues of guns, especially like where I grew up. It just wasn't a thing. But that day, for some reason, I did. And looking back, I think it was maybe me giving kind of a like one last chance to see like if we could get it right in church, and we didn't. And I didn't see a lot of people talking about it, and that's kind of when I just said, this is not right.
Hey everybody, Richard here, producer of The Disruptors. InterVarsity Press wanted me to let you know that you can go to ivpress.com/disruptors with an E to learn more about IVP books and get 30% off all titles with free shipping. And now, let's go back to the conversation.
And that day I went home, and I think I wrote some posts online about gun violence, and I had sort of publicly repented for my inaction and my silence on the issue, and that's kind of what launched me into this work.
The story that you're telling is the story of so many ethnic minorities in different ways who've come into church hoping that the pastor cares.
Yeah.
And it's always the second trauma. It's the first trauma of the event itself. And then you come to a community of faith saying maybe the pastor whose job it is to provide spiritual care will provide spiritual care on this significant portion of my life. But there are these certain things in certain sections of the certain aspects of the church that are off limits. And we know that they're off limits, but we're hoping that the pastor kind of breaks through for the sake of our own spiritual and emotional well-being. And part of what it means, at least to me, to become a disruptor is when you say, okay, now I've given everyone the opportunity. I'm going to have to step into this place that no one else steps into. And so the question is, how did people respond to those declarations? Because one of the things that I noticed is that I was very, very acceptable as long as I was lauding the scriptures and I was doing these things as an African American, until I brought racism and injustice into the conversation. Then all of a sudden I received these questions and these emails and these private messages. So how were you received when you first stepped forward and started talking about these things?
Oh, yeah, not great. I had never really been involved with more progressive or liberal circles before, but that's kind of how I found my home in those spaces, because I had written a lot up until that point about gun violence, but as it pertains to just evil in the world, and it's just a result of evil, and it's a heart issue, and et cetera, et cetera. And those posts had been shared a lot, always got really good comments and support from people I knew. And then as soon as I started talking about, well, guys, maybe guns are part of the problem, it made people really mad. And I started getting a lot of concern from people around me who were really worried about the path I was on.
There's a lot of concern about worry. There's a lot of concerns about worries and paths.
Yes.
And then I've noticed that's when the familial language, the family language comes in. Sister,
yeah.
I just want sister, or maybe they'll use your first name, Sister Taylor. I just want to know. So it's really interesting that have you thought more about why there's this link between conservative Christianity and guns? Because this is I'm going to sound like a pundit or something, but it seems pretty straightforward to say that Jesus wasn't super into violence, and so it seems like this strong link between gun protection and Christian faith seems, at least intuitively, seems strange. Have you thought about this at all in your journey?
Oh yeah. It's funny because it's one of those things, it's once you notice it, it's all you can think about, and you can't believe you ever thought differently. And the history is vast, but I think a lot of it kind of goes back to the moral majority and the Christian right, and how conservative Christianity kind of took over its role in politics and became the Second Amendment advocates. And now it just seems so antithetical to what the church should be advocating for. But when my husband and I started attending a Methodist church a few years back when we lived in Tennessee, I remember sitting there and I was looking through the bulletin, and there was something in the bulletin about how they were showing a documentary about gun violence. And I remember I just started like crying in my seat because I had never seen gun violence addressed in church, nonetheless a documentary about how like gun violence affects the community and all of that. And I just realized, oh, okay, some churches are doing this work and I need to find my place in those places. But the connection between guns and the conservative kind of American evangelical faith is still so baffling to me. But it's deep, and I think I didn't realize how that kind of American nationalism was driving that until the last couple of years. And I think a lot of people are talking about that now, and I just did not anticipate that those strong roots that it has, that guns and gun culture have, like in American Christianity.
If I know you may or may not be a Harry Potter person. I've read a whole Harry Potter book. Okay, so I'm up on the cutting edge of culture. And
I've only read the first one.
Okay, we're in the same place. I know there's magic in it. Okay, so
Yeah.
if I have no, and forgive me, Harry Potter fans, so there's no spell in Harry Potter that does this, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you had like a magic Harry Potter wand, and you could say, I want the entire church to know these things about gun violence that we seem to be kind of unaware of, what would it be? Like what data would you like stream to the whole Christian church for us to reflect upon and think about?
I think number one would just be the deep and long lasting effects that gun violence has on people. It's not just one event in a person's life, it impacts the rest of their life. And like I was saying before, I mean, gun violence is happening every day. Every day, 100 people are killed by gun violence and hundreds more are injured. And every time a shooting makes its way into the news, people who have experienced gun violence are constantly re-traumatized. And our pain is not even acknowledged by church. And when it is, oh, wow, that's so sad. What happened to you? We're so sorry you've been through that. But unfortunately, that's just a consequence of the rights we have in this country.
This idea that this is just the cost of doing business, is that hurtful for you?
The first time someone said that to me, I was so shocked by those words and just the lack of care, the lack of empathy. To me, hearing that is worse than just someone not acknowledging it all. Just to say, oh, well, we see how awful this is, but we can't do anything about it because this is our constitutional right. We get to have guns, and so unfortunately, this is just gonna keep happening. That is like one of the most hurtful things that is said. The biggest thing is just how unseen victims of gun violence feel by the church.
Taylor, this is Richard, the producer. I have a question for you. It sounds like a lot of what you dealt with, especially early on, is this feeling of like being alone in this within the church. And that's striking to me because I think all of us experience that in different ways, I think. But what's striking to me about this is it feels like uniquely lonely, because I feel like there's a contingent of like African-American Christians who can kind of get together and talk, and there's even black churches that they can go to. And then in my part, like I experienced a period of divorce, right? So I felt lonely, but I also had sort of like the implicit support of the church who acknowledged everyone knows divorce is bad, right? And it feels like, especially, so certainly like as a survivor of this, and also as a gun control advocate, sort of on both of those, in both of those ways for different reasons, it would be hard to find someone who could really like get it and understand what you were dealing with.
Yeah. A lot of it has to do with where I grew up and the people around me. And it was just not a thing to consider the gun. It was to look at everything else. Um, and even to just bring that up, like in a religious space, people weren't doing that because then it was going to veer into politics. Um, and, people don't want to do that in church, especially in conservative spaces. And I remember just like, I'd be up in the middle of the night and I would be like Googling shooting survivors support group, Christian shooting survivors. And I just never could find anything. And I kind of was able to just sweep it under the rug. And, I had a counselor, a wonderful Christian counselor, and she was super open to having these conversations with me. And, my husband was always really supportive, and he really helped me kind of process those feelings and has always been on the same page with me about this stuff. But then once I started speaking out about it, I realized just how lonely it was going to be. And even now, like working on my book, and doing the work I do online, like I have friends that we don't talk about it with. I don't talk about it with my family. And as much as they love me and like support me, they don't agree with what I have to say. And it's kind of what we were saying before, like people are always concerned about me and concerned about my heart and my faith and what path I'm on and what I'm listening to.
I think it's always instructive. And one of the interesting things about this, and we've kind of left this mostly to the side, is how racialized gun violence is.
Oh, yeah.
In the sense of like, we're here recording this right in the aftermath of what happens in Wisconsin, where there's a 17-year-old boy is walking down the middle of the street with an AK-47. And so there's a sense in which this isn't simply just like a gun issue. It's a racialized gun issue. Mm-hmm. And there's the problem of gun violence in African-American communities, which has its own sets of issues. And there's the problem of gun violence against African-Americans. But the interesting thing about this is how, when you start talking about these things, your faith is questioned. How does your Christian faith inform your gun activism and views?
So for me, the very basic, or what it boils down to really, is that if my life as a believer is to follow Jesus and to become more like him on this earth, then what does that look like for me? And for me, being more like Jesus is opposing things that are not in line with his vision for us as people on earth. And I cannot picture Jesus walking on the earth carrying a AR-15 down the street, protecting his personal property, being irresponsible with a weapon, and saying to someone who is suffering from gun violence that he's so sorry for what they've been through, but he's allowed to have a gun. When I think about it like that, it's just so easy to see that nothing about guns, nothing about gun culture, nothing about even this idea of self-defense and self-preservation goes along with what Jesus tells us in scripture, and what he wants for us, which is life and life abundant. And not only that, but even for people who haven't been through gun violence, it's this idea that Jesus runs towards those who are suffering and those who are hurting and in pain. And if we are to be like Jesus, then we are to do that as well. And to say, so these other people who are suffering, they're more important than myself. And I'm going to count them more important than myself and my safety and my rights. And we have this idea in America of like personal freedoms and personal liberties. And, even when we read about freedom in scripture, we learn that, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial to us. And we have freedom, but in our freedom, we're not supposed to sin, and we're supposed to use it to serve one another and love our neighbors. And so those ideas are kind of the overarching ideas for me when I think about how my faith informs my opinions about gun violence and gun reform.
So what do you then hope that people get from your book? Like if you say, if people read this and they completely, and you don't want to give them the whole book, don't give them the content because we want people to buy it. It's coming out. When is it coming out? In July, in January?
Next June
Oh, it's coming
2021.
out. Oh, you guys got to wait till next summer. It's okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
It'll be Gun Violence Awareness Month.
there we go. Gun
So
violence
yeah,
awareness.
next June.
So what do you hope that people get when they do get to the book? What are you hoping comes out of it?
I want gun violence to be more personal to them. I think for a lot of people, unfortunately, like any issues of justice related stuff, whether it's gun violence or racial inequality or what have you, um, it almost has to become personal before people are willing to take action on it. And um, so many people I talk to or that message me will say, I never knew anything about gun violence. I never knew anybody that had been affected by this before, but I started getting to know you and following you. And that helped change my mind. And that's when I realized like making these issues more personal can um, help people see why it's so important to get involved. And so I hope that when people read my story, they can see like this can happen to anyone, and it's happening to your neighbors and it's happening to people in your communities, whether you see it or not, and that we're not powerless to stop it. There are so many things that we can do, whether it's laws, which is kind of what we talk about most often, or community-based programs, which we know work, especially in like large urban underserved areas. Community-based programs that like intervention work that is working really well to reduce rates of gun violence. I want people to not feel hopeless, because I think when people feel hopeless, oh, there's nothing we can do, it will never change. It kind of gives us permission to not try. And that's not okay with me, because a lot has been done in the gun reform world, especially since Sandy Hook happened and the organization Moms Demand Action, Everytown Reformed. They've just really helped get a lot of work done. So it is happening, and we can do things to change it. And I want people to see that Christians have to take up their place in this fight for gun reform. Our presence is missed in these organizations, and people are looking around wondering like where Christians are and where people that are supposed to like love and serve others and care about life and be people with pro-life ethics, where we are when it comes to the issue of gun violence. And we need to get involved.
How do you sustain this work over the long haul? Because if you look at it, you can say this is a significant portion of the church. It's going to call me, everything but a child of God for caring about these things, and who are going to issue, send notes of concern. So how do you sustain something, and I say this, I'm someone who's saying like racism has to end, right? And so that's not something we're going to do by the weekend. And so gun violence seems like a similar Goliath. So how do you continue in this fight day after day, week after week, year after year, without becoming cynical, without giving up, without losing hope? Like what kinds of resources have you taken advantage of that allows you to do this repeatedly? How do you continue as a disruptor?
When I was writing my book, I came to like a point where it just felt so impossible and so like silly to even try to do this work. And that's kind of when I realized something has to change. And I wrote a note and taped it on my computer that just said, your book will not end gun violence. And that is not the point. And that helped me so much, just to remember that this is not all on my shoulders. Like you said, it's not going to get solved overnight. The point of my work is to be faithful with what God has called me to do, to share my story, to teach people what I know, to try to get people involved. And if I feel all this pressure to do it all by myself, and that I only have one chance, or like this conversation will change end gun violence forever, then that's like a burden I'm not meant to carry. And I cannot work under that. That's just like pure fear.
I did a similar thing when I was writing my book. This is the Anglican version of this. I got an icon of St. John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Because St. John the Baptist his thing was, I am not the Messiah. There's someone who's coming who is greater than me. And so I bought the icon of St. John and I put it in my office to remind myself that I'm not Jesus, that it's not my job to end systemic injustice. It's not my job to end racism.
Yes.
But what I can do, and I think this is what you talked about, what you're doing in your work, is point towards someone greater than myself while saying, I'm just being witness as best as I can understand it to what he would have us be. Is that a fair representation?
Yes,
Acknowledging
absolutely.
our limitations?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because then that gives me freedom to say, oh, this was a bad day and I'm tired and I need to rest, without feeling like my resting and my absence will delay the progress, or will be a detriment to the progress of the movement. And then I can effectively rest. And, I've made sure to have people in my life that I can go to and say, this is really hard and I'm really frustrated and I need a break. And can you encourage me? And am I doing the right thing? And that's been really helpful. And then kind of starting from a place where I'm meeting with God and then always returning to that place at the end of the day, and being honest and saying, God, I'm doing my best with this. And I don't know if this matters and I don't know if this means anything, but I'm just trying to do what I think you're telling me to do and what I feel I'm called to do. And just praying that God multiplies that work.
Now, there's one thing that you could say between now and buying your book that you want all Christians to do, like one practical step towards getting involved with gun activism. Is there something that you would direct them to, a resource, like a first step?
Look up how gun violence is affecting their local communities. There are a few websites you can do that on. You can search on everytown.org, or the Brady United is really good. They have some good info sheets. But just to find out how gun violence is affecting your local communities, I always tell people, I think it's on the Giffords website, you can look up how much gun violence is costing your state every year. I hate that money is like a motivator, but people you think you're not paying for the effects of gun violence, but you are. Like, if you're a taxpayer in this country, your money is going towards the effects of gun violence. And sometimes when people see that, again, I think gun violence is something where if you don't have to see it every day, it's easy to push out of your mind and to forget about. But that's harder to do when you are seeing how many people are shot, how many people die from gun violence in your own city or your own state, and see if there are organizations close to you that you could get involved with.
And where can they find your work? Where can we find Taylor?
You can find me at taylorschumann.com. I'm on Twitter at Taylor S. Schumann, and I'm on Instagram at Taylor Schumann Writes. All those links are on my website. And then you can also subscribe to my newsletter. It's called Bullet Points. And
wow.
And every month
that resonates.
Yeah. Every month I send out a newsletter, and we address like one area of gun violence and do some education. And there's always action steps involved, something to do that month. So I'd love to meet more people there.
I'm making a commitment that I'm going to subscribe to Bullet Points, and I want everyone who listens to this podcast for doing so, to do so. Thank you so much, Taylor. I always tell people, I know it's not easy to share something that was deeply traumatic in your own life. And I really do hope that this is something that we kind of put on the table as an important part of Christian discourse. And thank you for your witness, and thank you for your story.
Thank you so much.
There is a certain list of things that Christians can care about. And if you go outside of that list of things that you can care about, people start to question your faith and your spirituality. I want to burn that list to the ground on the podcast. I want to say that it's okay to say, I love Jesus, and because I love Jesus, I'm going to reduce gun violence. It's okay to be passionate about these things. We weren't there when they were creating the list. Like, I know there weren't any black people there when the list was. So in so much as we are trying to expand the nature of the Christian conversation, then I think that she was a valuable guest, and I would have her on again. We are literally in the wake of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Someone takes a gun and decides to go and defend the property that is not theirs. And because of that, people are killed. And I thought to myself, in what world do we have? I mean, I remember when I was in England, and they said to us, the tanks are rolling into the city. This is 2016, 2017. They said, well, why is the military patrolling American neighborhoods? It's because everything in America is ratcheted up. If everybody has a gun, then you need a tank, right? And so this escalating gun violence is creating this militarized culture, not just in the police, but in our communities. And we're saying, well, maybe there's another way of organizing our society, because everybody loses as it relates to gun violence. I have been shot at, and the people who shot at me did not have illegal access to a gun. Like, it's interesting. I didn't say this in the entire podcast. I was a victim of a drive-by. Someone pulled up to my house and shot my house up with guns that I'm assuming were illegal, they shouldn't have had access to. And that changed my life. That's another podcast for another day. But that changed my life, because I'm thinking, like, I almost died because this fool here had a gun. The amount of times I found myself running out of parties growing up because someone shot the party up. It was guns everywhere.
I can give up now, I keep it going. Settle down, not ever knowing. Won't let my history bury me, because I ain't doing this just for me.
I just think there's a better way of organizing our society
But I'm sounding off.
than weaponizing each other. Thank you for listening to The Disruptors. We will be grateful if you would subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow me at Esau McCaulley, and you can check out the best and most disruptive offerings from InterVarsity Press authors at ivpress.com.